Let me please welcome all of you to the Wallace Wurth Lecture. The Wallace Wurth Lecture we see at the University of New South Wales as one of our premier events. It commenced in 1964 and it commemorates the memory of the late Wallace Charles Wurth, who was the first president of the Council of the New South Wales University of Technology and thereafter became its first Chancellor. I especially welcome here tonight members of the Wurth family, and I note that Peter, David, Megan and Jane are all here and we welcome them. The first lecture was delivered by the then Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Sir Robert Menzies. Since that time, we've had all sorts of wonderful speakers from all walks of life, but not since 1964, quite a long time ago, has there ever been an Indigenous person give that speech. Tonight, we put that right. It is an enormous pleasure to ask Dr. Stan Grant to deliver his talk entitled From Reconciliation to Rights, Shaping a Bigger Australia tonight.
Thank you. I want to pay my respects to the peoples of the Eora Nation, Nadu Yinja Maramaindi Ninagare, the Yani Burgali Nura, the language of my people, the Wiradjuri people. I pay my respects to their elders and I ask that we're able to meet here tonight as one people. Pay my respects also to the family of Wallace Wurth and also to distinguished guests and all of you who've come here tonight. It's a hard week. Hard week. It's hard to give this speech tonight. There was a speech I had planned to give, and I wished it to be a speech rational and measured. In this speech, I would have appealed to the best of Australia, to what Abraham Lincoln would have called the better angels of our nature. In this speech, I would have wished to locate Indigenous people within the framework of the grand tradition of liberal Western democracy, that we could find a home in the Western liberal democracy of Australia, the great democracy of Australia. In this speech, I would have spoken of Hegel's idea of man not being at home in the world, not being at home in the world. I would have asked how we, the first peoples of this land, could be at home in a world imposed on us. In the speech I would have liked to have given, I would have spoken of Edmund Burke's template for society, that it be a covenant between those living, those gone, and those yet to come. I would have asked, what is this covenant? What would that be that would link my ancestors and my children? For us, it would not be the glory of nations won, but the sadness of nations lost. How then, after having our world upended, could we pledge allegiance to what has supplanted us? In this speech, I could have touched on those thinkers who are the pillars of Western democratic ideas. I would have told of how I've wrestled with the philosophy of John Locke or J.S. Mill, how they have inspired me and yet left me reeling from their implicit, harsh judgment of the society and the culture that I'm drawn from. I would have told of feeling both drawn to the steadfastness and stoicism of conservatism, yet wonder how so many of those who lay claim to the mantle conservative today can be so mean-spirited and have such a deficit of generosity. In this speech, I would have looked to contemporary Australian thinkers like Duncan Iverson. He's inspired me with his efforts to try to create a theory of justice that would enable us to feel at home in the world when we are no longer alienated from the institutions and practices of this society. That being at home in the world is not just having to be resigned to accepting or accommodating injustice. I would have quoted the late American philosopher John Rawls and his idea of reconciliation through public reason, of people being able to endorse the institutions and practices of society and not merely tolerate them. I would have explored what American political scientist William Connolly has termed the vital centre of the nation. I would have returned to John Stuart Mill, the Mill who could speak of a centre that could soften the extreme form and fill up the intervals between us. Soften the extreme form. Does that sound like the people who lay claim to being conservative today, who speak of exclusion and division, who speak with harsh judgment? This speech I wished to give would have sought amity with a tradition that has excluded us. In this speech I would have sought those things that unite us and not the things that divide. In this speech I would have chosen carefully my words. I would have sought less to inflame and more to comfort. I cannot give that speech tonight. Perhaps another day. That speech may have come from my head, but tonight I have to speak from my heart. Some of my own people have criticised me before for being too faithful to diplomacy. Sometimes they find fault in my hope or optimism. To my critics, I can sometimes give Australia too much credit. In another week, I might challenge them, but not this week. This week, I fear that they are right. This week, I have struggled to contain a pulsating rage. I have moved from boiling anger to simmering resentment, but the feeling has not passed, and nor have I wanted it to. Even as I wrote this speech, my words were powered by a coursing fury. My hands hovered above the keyboard in a fist. This is an anger that comes from the certainty of being. It's an anger that speaks to my soul, and it's an anger that I know to be just. This speech tonight does not look to Lincoln's first inaugural when he spoke of the better angels of our nature. Then, the great American president spoke words of brotherhood to a fractured nation on the eve of war. We are not enemies, but friends, he said. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. How I wish I could say that tonight. Another time, but not tonight. For this speech, I look to Lincoln's second inaugural. Here he stood before a country bloodied and worn. Victory was at hand, slavery at an end, but the president was tired. His country lay in ruin, his assassin lurked in the audience. Lincoln leaned on the Gospels to lay at the feet of his nation the sin of slavery. Woe unto the world because of offences. For it must needs be that offences come, but woe to the man by whom those offences cometh. Woe to the man by whom those offences cometh. What offences we've seen this past week. How can I stand here and speak to the idea of our place in an indissoluble commonwealth when this week my people have been reminded yet again that our place is so often behind this nation's bars? This week, my people know what Australia looks like. This week, Australia is a boy in a hood in a cell. This week, Australia is Aboriginal boys tear-gassed, locked down and beaten. These are the images on our television screens. The boys who look like my boys. And I watched my teenage son as he saw this unfold before him. I saw him lose his place in the world. With each scene of horror, he became less sure of his country. For he has not been raised to believe in our worst. He has been spared the fate of many of his people. But on that night, I know that he wondered about the difference between himself and the boys on that screen. For in those boys, I know that he can't help but see something of himself and ask how this country can allow it. When I saw the boys, I saw a tragedy that my sons have escaped, but I saw a reminder of the brutality that their grandfather and my grandfather had endured. I saw in those boys on my television screen the broken bones and stab wounds and dark ink tattoos scratched into the skin of my father on those long nights of the jail lockdown. I recalled the story of my mother's father, dragged from his bed by police, accused of drinking. That same man arrested and tied to a tree like a dog so that his children would pass by as they went to school. There are those who would rather I not speak of these things. There are those who accuse me of having a nostalgia for injustice. A nostalgia for injustice. As if these wounds on the body and soul of my mother and father are things of memory. As if we choose to cling to suffering, as if this injustice is a thing recalled and not a thing lived. A nostalgia for injustice. Such a charge could be levelled only by someone certain of his place in his country. A certainty denied to our people, the first people still searching for our place, estranged in the land of our ancestors. It could be levelled only by someone who sees injustice and brutality as something to be pondered and not endured. It is a charge brought by people comfortable in their own history while they tell us to forget ours, to get over it. These are people who value their traditions, exalt their heroes, and deny us ours. I wonder, would they dismiss the memories of the Jewish people so lightly? Are the Jewish memories of suffering too merely a nostalgia for injustice? These are people who proclaim themselves conservatives, but their meanness debases the very traditions they claim to uphold. These people who seize on difference, gay, Muslim, Asian, black, to vilify, divide, and demonise. All the while reserving for themselves the right to define our country and set the price of inclusion. Well, they don't define my country. These are people who wrap their words in civility to to mask the beating heart of their bigotry. How do these people, I wonder, square the supposed conservatism and professed love of country with the words of British conservative writer Roger Scruton when he says, individuals must be free, which means being free from the insolent claims of those who wish to redesign them. Yet these people seek to redesign us, to tell us who we should be and how we should think. These people would tell those boys on our television screens this week, the boys crying in agony, that they live in an imaginary world of pain. They would tell them that they are to blame for their treatment. They would tell the family of a 10-year-old Indigenous girl who takes her own life that they live in an imagined world of sadness. They would tell our people in overcrowded housing, in communities ravaged by violence and drug and alcohol abuse, that they revel in their misery. And they tell me I have a nostalgia for injustice. No. We have no nostalgia for injustice because we have not yet had the chance to forget. Polish Nobel Prize winning poet Czesław Miłosz spoke of his people, the Jewish people, carrying the memory of wounds. The memory of wounds. As Miłosz wrote, perhaps all memory is the memory of wounds. Certainly for us, these memories sit deep within our soul. Rather than long for these memories, rather than seek them out to try to give meaning to identity, in a perfect world I would wish them all away. But what has been done cannot be undone. What has been seen cannot be unseen. The scars of my father, the memory of my grandfather, these stories and images, the graveyard crosses of people gone too young are seared into my mind's eye, as surely as the charred flesh and the stench of blood from a lifetime reporting haunts my night's sleep. The memory of a hooded, bound boy in a cell is now similarly burned into my consciousness. Australia was redeemed from its complicity in this disgrace only by the national outrage that has followed. The Prime Minister responded by calling immediately for a royal commission. It may meet the minimum requirement for action. I wish it well. But forgive us if we lack faith. We have been poked and prodded for 2 centuries. We have been the subject of endless inquiry. The heads of our people rest still in glass jars in foreign museums, and our skeletons contained in cardboard boxes, the artefacts of inquiry. 2 decades ago, we held a royal commission into Black Deaths in Custody. It was supposed to end the culture of incarceration. Today, almost every face, man, woman, and child behind bars in the Northern Territory is black. Nationally, barely 3% of the population, and we comprise 1/4 of those in jails, half of those in juvenile detention. It is not to excuse the individual crimes to make plain the fact that every one of those people, Indigenous people, is a product of our country's history. It is a history still yet to be given its full account. It is a history still yet to puncture the public consciousness. It is a history born of terra nullius, the founding of a nation on the lie that this was an empty land. It is a history lamented in the 1960s by anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner as the great Australian silence. As he said, a cult of forgetting practiced on a national scale. Half a century later, his words still ring true. Rather than the Royal Commission, perhaps it is now time for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A full reckoning of our nation's past that may set loose the chains of history that bind this country's first people and hold us still so miserably impoverished. In my caution in the past, I've argued against such things, fearing it would potentially harden division. After this week, I accept that more than ever, we need this mirror into our soul. How can we continue to look at endemic child suicide, intractable disadvantage, and our choking jail cells as mere pieces of a policy puzzle scattered on a board, devoid of the outline of our troubled past? How do we fit the pieces of a puzzle when we don't even know where the pieces go? If we are to remember the fallen of Pozières and Fromelles, then surely we can remember the fallen warriors who resisted the invasion of their lands on this soil 200 years ago. We can remember my people, the Wiradjuri, and the martial law of Bathurst. We can recall the words of William Cox, given the first land grant on the plains west of the Blue Mountains, when he told a gathering at the height of the conflict, "It is better that all the blacks be shot and their carcasses used to manure the ground, which is all the good they are fit for." All the good they are fit for. My ancestors, the blood that runs through my children. And shot they were, poisoned and herded over cliffs, others ravaged by disease, half the population wiped out in a matter of years. What the Sydney Gazette, reporting at the time, called an exterminating war. And this is just the story of my own blood. Each of our hundreds of nations has its own similar history. This truth-telling would make good on the demand of French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, when he said, "We must remember because remembering is a moral duty. We owe a debt to the victims. By remembering and telling, we stop them being buried twice." We stop them being buried twice. Australia's war dead are etched on walls of remembrance, lest we forget. Our dead lie in fields forgotten, histories untold. Without such truth, where is our reconciliation? Is it just to be measured in economic statistics? Must closing the gap be the only way that we account for justice? Without such truth, what is this thing called recognition? I sit on the Referendum Council. It is our job to consult with Indigenous communities to try to give shape to what this constitutional reform, this recognition, might mean. Well, this week, the word itself, recognition, has felt small. In this week, it reeks of incremental shift when we cry out for fundamental change. What is this perversity that we should ask Australia to finally recognise us, a people who have been here from time immemorial. That we should ask others to decide whether we have a place in a constitution that was designed for our exclusion. This recognition lives in the netherworld of symbolism, when so many of the lives of our people are crushed by a real world that has never truly recognised them, that has rendered them invisible, out of sight and out of mind. We are asking Australia to recognise us when most Australians still admit to having never met an Indigenous person. They may likely hang a dot painting on their wall, having never touched the hand of the painter. This recognition doesn't speak to my father. He recognises himself when he speaks the power of his language. Still alive when Australia would have seen it silenced. Paladurajari Gibia, Dira Madalinya Barduwarajari. I am a Wiradjuri man, proud Wiradjuri man. In this week, how can this recognition excite our people, weary of a struggle for rights so long denied? Support for this recognition feels insipid, and its supporters can speak only with an air of resignation that the best we can get is less than we deserve. The best we can get is less than we deserve. I had thought that recognition may complete our nation, that it may fill the unfilled void. I saw it as a chance for Australians to recognise ourselves. I am prepared to say now that I put too much store in the power of such symbolism. Now my arguments feel timid. Recognition on these terms feels like betrayal of those who have fought for a justice more deserving and more dignified. Recognition risks shrinking our ambitions to fit a miserable national mood where the polity has lost faith in its politicians and once again people are hearing the siren song of one nation. This recognition is hostage to politics, and as we know, politics is so often the enemy of truth. This recognition demands finding common cause with those who have less interest in enlarging our nation and more in just containing it. This recognition demands a demoralising compromise with those who seek to do nothing more than the least that they can do. To give full flight to our aspirations would be to court failure in a country where only 8 out of 44 referendums held have been successful. What a damning state of affairs in a country that remains the only Commonwealth nation not to enshrine the sovereign rights of First Peoples. Are we really so stricken with lethargy on this subject? Must we be comfortable with our laggard status? Do we not look to New Zealand or the United States or Canada and ask, why too can we not negotiate treaties? Treaty even unattainable sings to the heart of Indigenous people here in a way that recognition cannot. So if recognition is what we are to have, if it is to mean anything, then we need to infuse it with the urgency of now. It needs to speak to substance, not symbolism. It needs to speak with hope to the hooded, beaten boys in dark prison cells. It needs to rise above the transactions of our daily lives to sing in our hearts. It needs to whisper to the conscience of our political leaders. If it is to mean anything, it needs to be imbued with the power to reorder our lives, to give real voice to the First Peoples. If the Constitution is our rule book, then we need to rewrite those rules. Anything less will speak to the poverty of our spirit and not the breadth of our vision. Can we do this? That part of me that wants to believe struggles with what my eyes have seen this week. Those boys, links in a chain that have bound us for 200 years. This recognition, what is it without truth? To quote the poet Milosz, crimes against human rights never confessed and never publicly denounced are a poison which destroys the possibility of friendship between nations. A nation poisoned by its inability to confess the truth. Can we confess these truths? My people have spoken this country's confession even when no one would listen. Our heroes have fought to fill out this country. They have held its greatness to great account. The heroes of the frontier, the warriors of the frontier, warriors like Pemulwuy, Windradine, Yagan, Jandamar, Tanamirawet, so many others who resisted invasion. Their spirit has lived in those who have followed. Joe Anderson, otherwise known as King Barraga of the Dharawal peoples, who said in 1933, all the black man wants is representation in federal parliament. There is plenty of fish in the river for us all and land to grow all we want. Victorian Aboriginal leader William Cooper, who in 1937 petitioned King George for representation in parliament. The years have not diminished our struggle. We have fought on many fronts. In 1963, the Yirrkala bark petitions were recognised by the Australian Parliament. The Yolngu people asserted the ownership of their lands and the right to be heard. In 1966, Vincent Lingiari walked off Wave Hill Station to demand equal pay and won his land when Gough Whitlam famously poured the sand through Vincent's fingers. Charles Perkins led a busload of students to smash segregation in outback New South Wales. In 1972, a group of activists pitched a tent on the lawns of Parliament House. As Aboriginal journalist John Newfong remarked at the time, the mission had come to town. In 1988, Yolngu leader Gullara Yunupingu presented the Barunga Statement to Prime Minister Bob Hawke, demanding what the Yirrkala people had demanded in their petition earlier, a treaty. Eddie Marbo, a man from Murray Island, took his battle to the highest court in the land and did not live to see his claim vindicated. This was indeed his land. After the apology to the stolen generations, Gullara Yunupingu gave a speech talking about what he called serious business, a final settlement. And still we wait. This week, we ask again, how long do we wait? I don't put myself in this pantheon. I live in the enormous shadow that they cast. Compared to their sacrifice and leadership, I feel wholly inadequate. I'm standing here because of them. I'm standing here because I was born into a strong and proud family that withstood the place that history had reserved for them. I stand here and I ponder the difference between my life and the lives of those boys on our television screens this week. We draw from the same well of history and are shaped by the same culture. I am part of them and they are part of me. Yet I have slipped those chains. I have made a place in the world. I have travelled. I've made friends in faraway places. I've seen the world's horror and its beauty. And I want for them what I have enjoyed. If we are to speak truth, then truth must be followed by liberation. If treaty or recognition are to mean anything, then they must draw a line between our past and our future. They must indeed be a final settlement. They must bring certainty and lead us into the world and not hold us out. Not separatism, but an inclusion, not an inclusion on someone else's terms, but an inclusion that recognises us for who we are. They must bring freedom and self-determination and demand of us the responsibility to make good on both. We cannot accept that rampant family violence, abuse and dependency is our way. History may have placed us here, but it need not hold us here. Our children must walk with pride in a world where they feel at home, where they feel they belong. Australia's challenge is to face itself and ask if it is a nation big enough to hold us all, to share who we are without demanding that those most disadvantaged or fewer in number yield to the more powerful. Can we, the First Peoples, find a place here that speaks to us as it speaks to our fellow citizens? Can we call ourselves Australians and see ourselves in this country? Just weeks ago, I held our Constitution and I felt its pull. In my hands was my country, imperfect and incomplete. Queen Victoria's signature of royal assent is fading, a faint reminder of how it required an act of British Parliament to make Australia a nation. The Constitution sits now protected under glass and dim light, lest the ravages of air and time erase it. Rarely is it removed, and I held it aware of that privilege. With that document yellowed and weathered, removed from its protective glass casing and resting in my hand, it did hold a powerful resonance. I thought of how the words of our founding document hang heavily with the weight of history. Those words speak from our past, define our present, and underwrite our future. On the day I held our Constitution, I held too the most powerful example of our capacity to change it. In my hand was the Constitution Alteration, in brackets Aboriginals, 1967. It went to a referendum and won 90.77% of votes cast and carried in all 6 states. For the first time, we could be counted as Australians, included in the census, no longer accounted for among the flora and fauna. In my right hand was the Australian Constitution. In my left hand was the belief that we could be better. Yet as part of me felt a pride, I was aware of how incomplete our nation remains. For there is still an enduring struggle for the rights inherent of the First Peoples. I crossed the hallway from the room in which the Constitution is preserved to another room which holds the inalienable aspirations of my people. 30 steps from the Constitution rests the Larrakia petition, Gwawa Daraniki. This is our land. The petition by the Larrakia people of the Northern Territory gathered more than 1,000 signatures from Aboriginal people across Australia and was delivered to the Queen in 1972. It is torn and frayed, and it speaks to me with a power still undiminished, a demand so just, so clear, and still so denied. It reads, "The British settlers took our land. No treaties were signed with the tribes. Today we are refugees," in capital letters. Refugees in the country of our ancestors. We live in refugee camps, without land, without employment, without justice. The petition then called for treaties like those of the Maoris of New Zealand and the Native Americans. The names of the signatories are scratched on the document. Some marked it just with their thumbprints. Whole communities had signed the names of their towns. I looked closely and I found mine, Griffith, New South Wales. From the Constitution to the Larrakia petition. For me, 30 steps that count the distance between my people and the Australian nation. This week, we have been reminded that we measure those 30 steps in lives lost and damaged. The Constitution speaks to me with resonance. The Larrakia petition tells me where I belong. When those two documents can speak to us all, we may have closed the journey of those 30 steps. I only have words, and I know that they may not be enough. They may pass into this night barely remarked. Many thousands of words have been spoken by people far more able, and still we fall short. And yet I turn to words, to the words of a man I turned to as I began this speech. I return to the words of the weary Lincoln, the Abraham Lincoln at the start of his second term, a man whose death stalked him as he spoke. As he said, "Let us finish the work we are in to bind up the nation's wounds." Mandangu, thank you.